Thank you very much. The title of the talk that's printed in the program is different from what I'm actually going to be sharing with you this afternoon, and I hope that the paper is still relevant in the sense that they were prepared in advance, and so the later papers tend to be somewhat overtaken by the conversation and discussion that's already gone on at the conference. In this paper, I adopt the academic convention of using the last names of the persons that I'm interacting with, and so I hope that doesn't spoil the conviviality that we've enjoyed during this conference so far. In this paper, I propose to analyze Wright's argument for the fact of Jesus' resurrection and assess its force in light of John Dominic Crossan's historical critique of the resurrection. In previous exchanges on Wright's book, which I've been privileged to attend, Crossan has declined to engage Wright's argument on the historical level, preferring instead to dialogue about the theology of the resurrection. And I think we saw that proclivity yesterday evening as Dr. Crossan preferred to speak of the meaning rather than the mode of the resurrection. And I take the mode of the resurrection to mean its factuality. And this lack of engagement shouldn't be allowed to persist, and therefore I've been very glad to see Dr. Wright in this conference, for example, last night, push Professor Crossan on how he would explain the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. And Charles Quarles and Craig Evans' critiques as well, which I think, if they are correct, are simply devastating for Crossan's skepticism, because Crossan's skepticism about the resurrection narratives is based fundamentally upon a source-critical analysis of these texts, which, if Quarles is right, is completely wrong. It means that rather than being based upon the single source of the cross gospel, the resurrection narratives, including the burial, the empty tomb, and the appearances, have multiple independent attestation in the earliest stratum of sources. And if Craig Evans is right about what he said about the secret gospel of Mark, that means that Crossan cannot explain away the role of the women in the discovery of the empty tomb by appeal to the residue left over from the secret gospel of Mark, which canonical Mark has scattered throughout his narrative. So those critiques, I think, are really devastating to Crossan's skepticism if they're correct. And this is exactly the kind of engagement that we need to have. Dr. Crossan's proclivity to speak of the meaning rather than the mode of the resurrection is based on his conviction that the historicity of Jesus' resurrection is, after all, not really theologically significant, so that even those who deny the historicity of that event can nonetheless be truly said to believe in the resurrection and to be faithful Christians. Unless we insist that Crossan engage with Wright's argument in detail on the historical level, we acquiesce in his pretension that the historical question really does not matter in the end. We must insist that he take on Wright's case and show where it is inadequate in specific detail, or else give up his claim that the resurrection of Jesus was not a historical event. Now, Wright lays out his argument for the historicity of Jesus' resurrection in Part 5 of his book, Belief, Event, and Meaning. Wright's case is very interestingly constructed. Typically, evidences of Jesus' historical resurrection would include 1, the discovery of his empty tomb, 2, his post-mortem appearances, and 3, the very origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. In Wright's case, this third element assumes pride of place and actually is used as evidence for the factuality of the other 2 elements. Having documented the centrality and essentiality of belief in Jesus' resurrection to the early movement named for him, Wright presses the question, what caused this belief in the resurrection of Jesus? Page 685. Wright presents his answer to this question as the conclusion to a 7-step argument based on necessary and sufficient conditions on page 687. And if we can have the PowerPoint now, his case can be summarized as follows. Number 1, the striking and consistent Christian alterations of the Jewish belief in resurrection rule out the possibility that the belief in Jesus' resurrection was generated spontaneously from within its Jewish context Rather, the early Christians ascribed the origin of this belief to the facts of Jesus' empty tomb and post-mortem appearances. Step 2. Neither the empty tomb nor the post-mortem appearances are individually sufficient to explain the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. Step 3. However, the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances are jointly sufficient to explain the origin of belief in Jesus' resurrection. 4. The meaning of resurrection in its Jewish context was such that belief in Jesus' resurrection could not have emerged unless it were known that his body had disappeared and that he had been discovered to be alive once more. Step 5. Rival explanations of the origin of the belief in Jesus' resurrection do not possess comparable explanatory power. 6. Therefore, it is historically highly probable that Jesus' tomb was indeed found empty and that the disciples did indeed encounter him alive and well after his death. And finally, step 7, the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances of Jesus are best explained by the hypothesis that Jesus was risen bodily from the dead. In summary, then, after showing that primitive Christianity believed that in the peculiar case of Jesus of Nazareth, a man had risen from the dead, separate from and in advance of the general resurrection of the dead, Wright argues that the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb, conjoined with physical post-mortem encounters with Jesus, would, in the context of Jesus' own messianic claims, be a sufficient condition for the disciples coming to believe such a thing about Jesus. On the other hand, Wright insists, in the absence of those two facts, there is nothing in the historical antecedents of the Christian movement which could plausibly explain the origin of the disciples' belief that God had raised Jesus from the dead. Wright's argument thus far, then, amounts to the claim that the hypothesis of the facticity of the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances has far greater explanatory power with respect to the origin of the belief in Jesus' resurrection than any known rival hypothesis. Notice that this hypothesis is not equivalent to the hypothesis that Jesus rose from the dead, and thus far forth involves only non-miraculous facts. Only when we come to step 7 does Wright infer to Jesus' resurrection as the best explanation of the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances. Now, if we could go back to step 1 on our PowerPoint. Wright's argument is not very tightly formulated. Step 1, for example, is really extraneous to the argument. The inadequacy of the hypothesis that belief in Jesus' resurrection emerged spontaneously due to Jewish influences is comprised in step 4 of the argument. The fact that early Christians ascribed the origin of their belief in Jesus' resurrection to the discovery of his empty tomb and post-mortem appearances is ultimately irrelevant so long as 4 is true. Crossan would deny that early Christians ascribed the origin of their belief in Jesus' resurrection to the discovery of his empty tomb and his post-mortem appearances. But that would not suffice to refute Wright's argument so long as the remaining steps are true. Thus, 1 does not really add anything to the case. Again, a little reflection shows that 2, if we could go to that slide, does not contribute to the argument either. What is critical to Wright's argument are the claims that the facts of the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances are jointly sufficient, that's step 3, and individually necessary, that's step 4, to explain the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. The fact that the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances are individually insufficient to explain the rise of resurrection belief could be freely granted by Crossan without prejudice to his skepticism about the historicity of the events of Easter. The skeptic has no problem affirming that the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances are individually inadequate to explain the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. So the real meat of Wright's argument comes with step 3, if we could transition to that slide again, which implies that the hypothesis of the facticity of the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances has the explanatory power to account for the origin of belief in Jesus' resurrection. I think that Wright's claim that the discovery of the empty tomb and the post-mortem appearances are jointly sufficient to explain the rise of resurrection belief is relatively uncontroversial, given that we are talking about physical appearances, not mere visions. If Jesus' tomb were found empty and he appeared physically alive after his death, then, given the context of his messianic claims, it seems very probable that the disciples would come to believe that God had raised him from the dead. Even Crossan would, I think, concede the point. Crossan's skepticism about the adequacy of the empty tomb and apparitions of Jesus or appearances of Jesus to explain the origin of the disciples' belief expressed yesterday evening was only because he was taking those facts in isolation from Jesus' proclamation of the advent of the kingdom of God. But given its religio-historical context, I think Crossan would concede that these factors are sufficient to explain the origin of belief in Jesus' resurrection. The more controversial claim then comes with step 4, if we could move to that the facticity of the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances are individually necessary conditions of the origin of belief in Jesus' resurrection. You'll remember that Crossan yesterday evening expressed skepticism about this. He said that simply the proclamation of Jesus of the advent of God's kingdom plus visions of Jesus would be sufficient to generate the disciples' belief in his resurrection. By contrast, Wright wants to show that the rise of resurrection belief necessitates the historicity of the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances of Jesus. In support of this claim, Wright presents two considerations. Number one, he says the very meaning of the word resurrection rules out most of the rival alternatives. And two, the principal alternative hypotheses turn out to be insufficient. Now, the first consideration, that the meaning of the word resurrection rules out most alternatives, is not very carefully articulated. What Wright argues is that, subpoint 1, the vocabulary for resurrection in then current usage entailed the rising of the dead man to new life, so that an empty grave must be left behind. And that, subpoint 2, appearances of the dead man are necessary to generate belief in his resurrection, since an empty grave alone is ambiguous. We may grant these points. But it does not follow that, quote, if the body of Jesus of Nazareth had remained in the tomb, there would have been no early Christian belief in Jesus' resurrection, end quote. Rather, what follows from subpoint 1, the meaning of the term resurrection, is that if the disciples had thought Jesus' body remained in the tomb, they would not have come to believe in his resurrection. In other words, the necessary condition of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection, given the meaning of that word, is their belief that the body no longer lay in the grave. Kiersop Lake's wrong tomb hypothesis was consistent with that condition. So is Crossan's hypothesis that Jesus' body was thrown into a common graveyard for criminals and its location forgotten. Here, Wright's failure to discuss the historicity of the burial narrative in his survey of the Gospels constitutes a shortcoming in his argument. Wright is correct when he characterizes attempts, like Crossan's, to deny Jesus' burial by Joseph of Arimathea as, quote, desperate, end quote. But there is a lacuna in his argument here that needs to be filled. Wright could try to fill it by appealing to his arguments earlier in the book that it is highly unlikely that belief in Jesus' resurrection, as attested in Paul's letters, could itself have generated stories of the empty tomb such as we find in the Gospels, that in chapter 13, section 3. But he insisted there that he was not arguing for the historicity of the narratives, merely their logical and chronological priority to the theology we find in Paul. He needs to show that the disciples' belief in Jesus' empty tomb would not have arisen unless the tomb of Jesus were in fact empty. His case would be stronger if he were to present independent evidence for the historicity of the burial of Jesus of Nazareth in a tomb whose location was known in Jerusalem. This is easily done. At least 9 lines of historical evidence support the historicity of Jesus' burial in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea. Given the historicity of the burial narrative, it is indeed difficult to see how belief in Jesus' resurrection could arise and flourish in Jerusalem in the face of an occupied tomb. The historicity of the burial narrative, which is recognized by the majority of New Testament historians today, is a dagger in the heart of Crossan's skepticism. What then about Wright's sub-point 2, that appearances of the dead man were necessary to generate belief in his resurrection, since an empty grave alone is ambiguous? Well, clearly, from the meaning of the word resurrection, one cannot deduce the fact of appearances. Wright's point is rather that appearances of Jesus are a necessary condition of the disciples coming to believe in Jesus' resurrection. His argument here could be stronger, however. He discounts the hypothesis that dreams could have produced belief in Jesus' resurrection because dreams would not lead to belief in a person's resurrection. Quite so. But that only proves that dreams alone are not a sufficient condition for the disciples' belief. The question here is whether dreams conjoined with the discovery of Jesus' empty tomb might not have led to belief in his resurrection. Or, more plausibly, visions of Jesus conjoined with his empty tomb. Why are real appearances necessary? On this score, Wright needs to explain more thoroughly the distinction between resurrection and assumption into heaven in Jewish thinking, and show how the latter would be an explanation of visionary experiences more consonant with Jewish beliefs than the former. Had the disciples experienced merely visionary appearances of Jesus, as Crossan suggests, such experiences, even when conjoined with the fact of his empty tomb, not to speak of in the absence of an empty tomb, would at most have led them to believe in and proclaim Jesus' exaltation to heaven, in line with Jewish beliefs, not his resurrection from the dead, in contradiction to Jewish beliefs. Thus, Crossan's objection to Wright actually returns in spades to undermine his own hypothesis. Even an empty tomb conjoined with visions would at most have led to belief in Jesus' exaltation and assumption to heaven, not in his resurrection. Now, this is not to say anything that Wright has not already eloquently explained elsewhere, but he needs to marshal his evidence at this point. So, Wright's first consideration in support of the necessity of the empty tomb and resurrection appearances might be more carefully articulated as the claim that the original disciples would not have proclaimed Jesus' resurrection from the dead had they not experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death and found his tomb empty. It seems to me that this claim is quite correct and capable of being argued even more forcefully than Wright has done. Wright's second consideration in support of the necessity of the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances, it will be recalled, is the insufficiency of alternative hypotheses to explain the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. Here, he provides an excellent discussion of the hypotheses of cognitive dissonance and a fresh experience of grace. But his critique of the former hypothesis is again not as strong as it could be. For the important point to be made here is that, given the arguments of chapter 13, section 3, the surprise of the resurrection narratives, the disciples, if they were to have persisted in believing in Jesus due to cognitive dissonance, would not have produced the sort of narratives we find in the Gospels. And I noticed that Dr. Wright last night did emphasize that point very clearly, and I was glad to hear it. The lack of scriptural proof texting and allusion, the absence of any mention of the believers sharing in the hope of eschatological resurrection, the conspicuous absence of apocalyptic descriptions of the risen Christ in luminous glory, the prominent role played by women in the narrative, all point to these narratives not being the free creation of persons who imagine the resurrection of Jesus as a means of resolving the cognitive dissonance brought on by his death. These same sort of considerations weigh heavily against Crossan's view that the resurrection narratives are fictional creations of the early church. Wright concludes this step of his argument with the words, "Nobody was expecting this kind of thing. No kind of conversion experience would have generated such ideas. Nobody would have invented it no matter how guilty or how forgiven they felt, no matter how many hours they pored over the Scriptures. To suggest otherwise is to stop doing history and to enter into a fantasy world of our own, a new cognitive dissonance in which the relentless modernist, desperately worried that the post-Enlightenment worldview seems in imminent danger of collapse, devises strategies for shoring it up nevertheless." Well said. Nothing to my knowledge that Crossan has written suffices to turn back the force of this conclusion. On the basis of his argument thus far, Wright judges the historical probability of the dual facts of the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances of Jesus to be, and I quote, "so high as to be virtually certain as the death of Augustus in AD 14 or the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. Now comes the final step in the argument. What is the best explanation of the facts of the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances? Wright casts his argument here as an inference to the best explanation. But he again focuses on explanatory power, leaving aside other criteria, such as explanatory scope, plausibility, degree of ad hocness, and so forth. The resurrection hypothesis explains the empty tomb and appearances. Its rivals, he claims, do not. Wright recognizes that here we come face to face with worldview considerations. There is, he says, no neutral ground. It is not entirely clear to me what Wright's answer to Enlightenment naturalism is. He seems to say that the spirit of the Enlightenment is not to close a priori any door to understanding, and then to invite the naturalist to shift grounds and see if the facts do not make better sense within a theistic worldview than within a naturalistic worldview. Of course, such an invitation will appear all the more inviting if a robust natural theology can be given in support of a theistic worldview, as my colleague Doug Guyvett has emphasized. Arguments for a creator and designer of the universe, which are analogous to Wright's case for the resurrection, can be provided using historical sciences like cosmology. If one is convinced on the basis of arguments from necessary and sufficient conditions that the origin and fine-tuning of the universe is best explained by the existence of an ultra-mundane creator and designer of the universe, then the argument that Jesus' empty tomb and post-mortem appearances are best explained by Jesus' resurrection from the dead will be all the more compelling. Wright concludes with a summary of reasons for rejecting the principal alternative explanations of the empty tomb and appearances. Unfortunately, here again there is confusion. The four rivals he considers, namely the immortality of Jesus' soul, Jesus' non-physical resurrection, a parallel trajectory of Jesus' exaltation, and retrojection of later Christian beliefs, are in fact denials of the empty tomb and appearances, not explanations of them. These hypotheses should have been considered and rejected in his earlier discussion in step 4 concerning the necessity of the facts of the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances in explaining the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. The rivals that should be considered here are those few hypotheses that concede these two facts and then try to explain them naturally. Wright simply laterals the ball to Gary Habermas at this point, referring the reader to his survey of rival hypotheses. Here, I simply register my agreement that attempts to explain the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances apart from the resurrection of Jesus are hopeless. And that is precisely why skeptics like Crossan have to row against the current of scholarship in denying facts like the burial and empty tomb of Jesus. For once these are admitted, no plausible naturalistic explanation of the facts can be given. So if I might be allowed to reformulate Wright's argument in what I think is a more sound way, let me ask the PowerPoint to bring up my recasting of his argument. Premise 1, early Christians believed in Jesus' resurrection. 2, the best explanation of that belief is the hypothesis that the disciples' discovery of Jesus' empty tomb and their experience of post-mortem appearances of Jesus. Supporting argument 2.1, the hypothesis of the disciples' discovery of Jesus' empty tomb and their experience of post-mortem appearances of Jesus has the explanatory power to account for that belief. Supporting argument 2.2, rival hypotheses lack the explanatory power to account for that belief. Supporting argument 2.21, the hypothesis of spontaneous generation within a Jewish context. 2.22, hypothesis of dreams about Jesus. 2.23, hypothesis of cognitive dissonance following Jesus' death. 2.24, hypothesis of a fresh experience of grace following Jesus' death. 2.25, etc., any other naturalistic explanation such as Gary considered. Step 3 of the argument, then, will be that the best explanation for the facts of Jesus' empty tomb and post-mortem appearances is the hypothesis that Jesus rose from the dead. Supporting argument 3.1, the resurrection hypothesis has the explanatory power to account for the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances of Jesus. Supporting argument 3.32, or rather 3.2 actually, rival hypotheses lack the explanatory power to account for the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances of Jesus. And here we consider 3.21, the conspiracy hypothesis, 3.22, the apparent death hypothesis, 3.23, hallucination hypothesis, 3.24, etc., any of the other explanations that Gary reviewed for us. And I think this is a better casting of the inference to the best explanation that N.T. Wright wants to offer. So in conclusion, then, I think that Wright's book is best seen as the most extensively developed version of the argument for the resurrection of Jesus from the fact of the origin of the disciples' belief in Jesus' resurrection. An argument which may be supplemented by comparably strong or even stronger independent arguments for the empty tomb and post-mortem appearances of Jesus, and then for his resurrection. Wright's book is an invaluable reference work and a benchmark of resurrection scholarship.
Thanks very much, Bill. That was great. And I just love your tidying up of what I did. Next time my desk is in a real mess, I will give you a phone call, and you're welcome to sort out my messy piles of paper into 3 piles with subpiles anytime you like. That'll be just great. I actually have a rather fuzzy memory of writing those final chapters because the publication date was rushing towards me, and I'd spent such ages trying to do the earlier bits of the book. And I did actually fiddle around with those 7 arguments quite a lot, and I was aware that they overlapped at certain points. I think the difficulty is, and I completely take your point, that as that line of argument stands, some bits seem to be either otiose or not quite in the right shape. I think I was more conscious than one would be simply approaching the seven cold, as it were, of several key things which people like Robinson, Ludemann, etc., would be urging at certain points, so that instead of simply saying, right, here's the argument, 1, 2, 3, bang, I was still, as it were, saying, by the way, those guys are out of line because of this, and they're not going to get a look in here, and so on. So that when I look at the summary of the seven, I can still see the logic that I thought I had in it, because I'm still trying to make sure that other things don't creep in alongside, like the false brethren in Galatians 2, whereas you're simply lining it up as a sort of a grand summary, and I accept that, and I'm really grateful. This is, of course, another yet more things for the second edition. I wish. Let me just say a couple more things. I think you say step one is extraneous to the argument. Well, it is and it isn't. The point there surely is that the mutations that I track, which I described in detail last night, and to which I'm now adding a seventh, the collaborative eschatology that Dom put out, these are things which rule out the hypothesis that belief in Jesus' resurrection was spontaneously generated from within Judaism. Now, you have relocated that within your neater structure, and so it may well be that had I allowed myself the luxury of the little numbers, the 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, whatever, I might have been able to go that route. The question about the vocabulary of resurrection then in current usage, it's not so much the vocabulary of resurrection and the different words they might have used. It's more that what we summarize with the word resurrection is a concept which is of a two-stage post-mortem existence, of which the second is a re-embodiment or a transformed embodiment or something. So I don't think I was making an argument based closely on precise words. Indeed, I'm rather aware that I didn't do as much detailed philological study at that point as I might have done, but rather on, if it's resurrection you're talking about this two-stage post-mortem existence of which the second, etc. So I don't think it was just on that. Let me just say, you say about my claim too that appearances of the dead man were necessary to generate belief in his resurrection. You don't really mean that, do you? You mean of the appearances of the man who had been dead. Because that's quite key, because Dom says at the beginning of Birth of Christianity, it all began with visions of a dead man. And I want to say visions of a man that had been dead and now was no longer, because the whole point about the Greg Riley type visions which Dom is drawing on there is precisely that those guys still are dead and this one isn't. And that really is a huge difference. I died and behold I am alive forevermore. The whole point about Jesus' death in New Testament theology is that unlike everyone else's death, before and so far since, he died, but his death can be spoken of in the aorist rather than in the perfect. In other words, it was an event, but it does not have continuing consequence in the way that all other deaths have had. So that's a small point, but I think quite important. The business about why real appearances were necessary and why visions plus empty tomb wouldn't have done surely is because, and I thought I said this, if they'd had visions which they could have described as in any way subjective, using our language, dreams, etc., they knew about those things. And if they had had these very vivid experiences but didn't really think they were bodily, then even those plus an empty tomb would have left a puzzle rather than a resurrection, because they knew about they knew about dreams and visions. I think that's just about it. Oh, yeah, the natural theology again. Well, okay. I just do think that, for all sorts of sort of worldview-ish reasons, that the resurrection is the foundation of a Christian epistemology. I'm just repeating what I said before, and that Paul's view of natural theology in Romans 1:18 following is that we know enough about God's power to condemn us because we don't do anything about it. I really don't think it gets you much further than that. And this may just be a contextual thing, that because I live in England and where we are bombarded by people like Richard Dawkins all the time telling us that, some form of neo-Darwinianism is what you'll get if you look at the natural order, you've got to have a whole lot of chutzpah to start mounting arguments that actually, we look at it like this and we can see an awful lot of God out there, so this creates a context within which resurrection is a bit more certain. I actually do think I'm putting all my eggs in the basket of saying Jesus really did rise from the dead, and because of that, all the hints of God which are out there in the world actually make sense. I mean, I have a whole argument of a sort of natural theology which has to do with hearing what I call the echo of a voice in justice, in beauty, in all sorts of things in the world, things which are hard to explain if the world is simply a random collection, etc., etc. But I see them as an echo of a voice, and then the voice itself comes, and then we say, that's what I was listening to, but without this I couldn't have told. So maybe I'm a third of the way to a natural theology, but I think that's probably as far as you're going to push me at the moment. Yeah. Tom.
Bill, that I have never encountered Tom on the historical level. Actually, yes. Both of us, in reviewing one another's Jesus and the Victory of God and the Birth of Christianity in the Scottish Journal of Theology, we dragged one another over the coals on that. What I noticed immediately in Tom's book, in reading it, was it didn't start, as Tom said quite deliberately, with the Traditionsgeschichte of the resurrection stories. In replying to it, I respected that. If he'd started there, I'd probably have started there too, with the burial and the empty tomb. He started with something historical. What did this term, resurrection, mean for ordinary Jews who were, say, before Christianity ever arrived, were arguing for and against it? A Sadducee and a Pharisee arguing for it and against it, what were they talking about? And Tom's answer is the general bodily resurrection. I think that's an historical statement. I think it's correct. But it carries with it, of course, all the eschatological understanding that's in it, and that can't be left out. So he started there. That's historical. I started there too. Basically, I'm pretty much agreeing with him on all of that. I just added a few small things. When you turn then to the Christian one, then Tom's asking the question, how do you explain the origins of Christian resurrection faith? He gives two reasons to explain it. That he's still talking history. I said, still talking history. Those two are not adequate as historical explanations. They'll get you to exaltation. They will not get you to resurrection, precisely because Tom had explained that resurrection was such a huge jump, to split the resurrection, was a huge jump. I thought it would take also what you hinted at, the messianic claims of Jesus, which somehow disappeared from up there. They're in your paper. But you said the empty tomb and the risen apparitions, let's take them exactly the way you do for the moment, within the messianic claims of Jesus. I think it's mentioned twice in your paper, but it's not in your schema. That is my point to Tom. I think even if you take in the most literal sense the empty tomb, and you take the risen apparitions not as any sort of visions we've ever had, but unique visions, I'm still saying, as a historian, not as a skeptic, I operate as a historian. I'm making an historical judgment that is not adequate to explain it. I think you need the third thing, namely that Jesus had announced the kingdom of God as already present. I won't beat that, but all of those are historical judgments. And they're actually honoring the way Tom laid out his argument. I could have, and maybe 5 years ago I might have, ignored everything he did and went right for Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Traditionsgeschichte. Now, let me take an example of what I would not call skepticism. I make historical judgments. They may be quite wrong, but they're still historical judgments. And to call them skepticism really doesn't help. And to repeat the word really doesn't make it true. Let me give you an example. What is really important for me, what I was spending the 60s doing, and the 70s, but 50s and the 60s mostly because I was in a monastery and I hadn't much else to do. I was really working day after day, hour after hour, on synoptic problem, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I really was. Reading them in parallel columns, trying to get it clear in my mind, the relationship. Now, that was the 60s. All sorts of other people had much more entertaining lives in the 60s, but I was in a monastery. So I really did all of that. I did that work first for myself. And at the end of it, I came to certain conclusions. Now, these are historical conclusions. They may be totally wrong. Mark was the first gospel. Duh. Matthew and Luke were based primarily on Mark. Let's leave Q out of it for the moment. The big decision I had to make about was John. And that would be crucial for me. And if I'm wrong on John, a lot of things have to change. I decided that John, at least for the frames of John, the beginning and the ending, was based on Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's an historical judgment. It's not a creedal statement. If it's wrong, lots of things are going to have to be changed. But that was my conclusions. And certain things that I saw that really surprised me. How come they all have to depend on Mark? How come as soon as Mark ends with the empty tomb, they all go in different directions? As if now we're on our own. What do we do? That surprised me. I really would have expected, at least on the passion and the resurrection, leave out the resurrection because they are different, but on the passion, they'd have multiple independent stories. That does surprise me. So now, when I come to the burial, I'm carrying the baggage of the presupposition that Mark is the source and only source for Matthew, Luke, and John. I'm watching, in other words, a stream of tradition from about 70 to 95. What I find is a perfectly plausible story of the burial in Mark's Gospel. It seems to presume a good, pious Jew, like in the book of Tobit, who will not leave this corpse on the cross and buries it. Is it possible? Absolutely. Absolutely. I see nothing there that offends anything. I watch Matthew and Luke reading it, and Matthew and Luke are the first and most careful readers of Mark as far as I'm concerned. They see two problems. If he was a member of the Sanhedrin, the Boule at least, as Mark suggests, wasn't he against Jesus? And Matthew answers that, as I see it, by saying, well, he's a rich man, don't put him in the Sanhedrin. And Luke puts him in the Sanhedrin and says, but he didn't agree with what they did. But there's a second problem they both see. If this is a pious person who takes care of corpses out of respect for Deuteronomy, then he would have to take care of at least 3 corpses. So both of them say, and I have to say independently, it's a new tomb. So no problem. Jesus is the only one in there. Then when I get to John's Gospel, I finally find a magnificent, absolutely magnificent, and nobody describes it better than the late lamented Ray Brown, is super magnificent. The burial not of a king, but of a god. I watch that stream of tradition. I see it change until finally in John we get the proper burial for the Son of God. Now I ask myself a rather ghastly question. 70 to 30. What's in there? Is there a tradition that was passed down and Mark just happened to get it down and then nobody else knew it but had to follow Mark? That's where I have trouble as a historian. I want to know, is it possible that Mark created it? And to answer that, of course, I have to explain why Mark would have created it. And my explanation, and that's what Craig had referred to in the Werner Kelber book, so 27 years ago, I think you said, was a decision, again an historical decision, not skepticism, that Mark had created the story of the finding of the empty tomb. It doesn't raise the issue of was there an empty tomb. The story of the women and the finding of the empty tomb in order specifically to avoid apparitions to Peter and the 12, who he's been pretty much thrashing through his entire gospel. Therefore, of course, if that's right, they were there before Mark. Absolutely. So I asked myself then, what do I think happened to Jesus, to the body of Jesus? And that's where the horror begins to appear. Because I don't think they knew. If I found 4 independent versions of, say, the family of Jesus, those closest to Jesus, buried him, then I would take that for granted as, of course, they bribed the soldier or whatever happened. Or Jesus was dead and the soldiers didn't give a hoot. They took off for the barracks and they were free to. So my problem is that yawning 40 years Does Mark have more than hope? Does he have history? And if he doesn't have history, then the full horror of crucifixion, the full intention of crucifixion, which was to annihilate the person by trying to leave nothing, that's what yawned before me. Now, that may be totally wrong as an historical reconstruction, but I insist it is an honest historical reconstruction. It's not sort of just blind skepticism. It may be wrong, but it's still an historical reconstruction. And the person, of course, who has the opposite is also making an historical construction, and one of us is right, the other. But what's rock bottom for me is not the Gospel of Peter. I was trying to think when you were saying, if I'd never heard of the Gospel of Peter, what would change? No, it's that Mark is the only source for Matthew, Mark, and Luke. If that's wrong, if, for example, Mark and John were independent, then obviously we have two accounts of the burial. What would disqualify that completely? If we ever found any other tradition about the burial of Jesus that was independent of Mark, that would finish it for me. Now, I'm quite willing to say when Paul says dead, buried, that he might be taking it absolutely for granted there's an empty tomb somewhere. Totally for granted. In the same way that the cross gospel, if it's really there from the 40s, take it for granted. Of course there's an empty tomb. You just watch Jesus leaving it. Got to be empty. So, even if you thought the cross gospel was the earliest one, you have an emptying tomb, if you prefer it that way. So, that's not an issue for me. I can bracket the Gospel of Peter on this one because Mark seems to be the only source. Okay? Thank you.